morning and happy Wednesday. I'm going to attempt to do another video on my thoughts about the Jews and the Gentiles and just the amazing history of the Bible and the Jewish history of God choosing the Jews through Abraham back in the Old Testament times and choosing Jesus, the Messiah, to come through the Jewish race. And as you read through the Bible, the Old Testament, I still have a lot of the Bible to read through more thoroughly, of course, and there's always new things to learn. But just knowing the history, again, of the Jewish race, God choosing Abraham to be the father of the Jews, and planning as foretold in the Old Testament by the prophets and others in the books of the Old Testament about the coming of the Messiah, Jesus, which is where the New Testament of the Bible begins, with the birth of Jesus. Sorry for the noise. And Jesus being born in Bethlehem in Israel, and the prophecy of him becoming the Messiah, but not just the Messiah to the Jewish race, but the Messiah to the entire world. In the Bible, it's kind of divided up, especially in the New Testament, well, the Old Testament as well, but in the New Testament, we're kind of divided up into Jews and then Gentiles. Jews being the Jewish race in Israel, and the Gentiles being the rest of us outside of the Jewish race. Sorry, my arm's getting tired. And when you go into the New Testament, the Jews end up rejecting their own Messiah that came through them, Jesus, or Yeshua, because he didn't look like they thought he was going to look. Traditionally, Jews started cultivating the belief that their Jewish Messiah was going to be a political figure that was going to overthrow all of the nations that were oppressing them at the time. When Jesus was born, the Roman government was in place, and they basically had ultimate control of the Jews, and the Jews were living under the Roman rule. And they didn't like that. And they had been oppressed by other nations as well, all throughout history. And the idea that was cultivated among the Jewish people was, again, that their Messiah would be a political figure that would overthrow their earthly enemies and the earthly governments that were oppressing them. So when Jesus came, he came as a humble servant. He came as a baby. And he came to serve and to die for the Jewish race and their sins, and for the rest of us, Gentiles, if you will, and our sins as well. And that was the ultimate plan since the beginning of time. And because this didn't coincide with the Jews' ideas of what a Messiah would look like, they rejected him. And it was pretty much prophesied that they would reject him as their Messiah. And then because of that, they would go out into the rest of the world. The message of Jesus would go out into the rest of the world, for the rest of the world to be told the message of Christ. And then ultimately brought back to the Jews. This is a very simplistic version of history. But it would be brought back to the Jews, and they would still have opportunity to be saved by their own Jewish Messiah. And again, the ultimate plan is that the Messiah would be for all of us. But it's such poetic irony that the people, the race that Jesus, Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, came through, that his own people would reject him, which was really prophesied in the Bible before Jesus even came. There are prophecies in the Old Testament about Jesus. If you look in the book of Isaiah, Isaiah 53 and other chapters describe the humble servant and Jesus coming to die for humanity. So when you get into the New Testament, Jesus is born, he dies on the cross, he's raised from the dead 3 days later. Again, sorry, my arm is hurting, so I keep having to switch a little bit. He died, he rose again, and the message of his death and resurrection and salvation was first brought to the Jews, and many Jews rejected it, though some Jews at that time were also receiving it. So ultimately, it was being preached to the Gentiles, and the apostles who were Jewish were basically shown by Jesus that this message of Jesus' death and resurrection and salvation for our sins was not just for the Jews, but was for the entire world. And the apostles who were Jewish began to see this truth. The Spirit began to show them this truth. And so in the book of Acts, which is a great book, I highly recommend it, is where so many things happened in the book of Acts, but this is where Saul of Tarsus, a devout Jew, a Jew of Jews, if you will, born into the staunch tradition of Judaism. He was a Pharisee, which was a strict Jewish sect back at the time. He began, because of his zealousness for the Jewish traditions, began to kill Christians at that time. When Christianity started spreading after the death and resurrection of Christ, Saul of Tarsus got word of what was happening, and he thought it was his mission from God. He thought it was a mission from God that these Christians be killed because they were contradicting, or not, they weren't contradicting, but I think in his mind, he saw them as going against Judaism by believing that Jesus was the Messiah. And so he was killing Christians, persecuting, killing them, jailing them at the time. And in Acts chapter 9, Jesus comes to Saul in a vision while he is on his way to Damascus, knocks him off his horse, basically, and says, Saul at the time, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting me? And Saul says, who are you? Who are you, Lord? In this vision, and he says, Jesus, I am Jesus the Messiah whom you are persecuting. And I want you to go see a certain person, and I want you to stay with him. And then eventually he was blinded when this happened because of the light. So he was blind for a time. And at that time, no doubt Jesus was dealing with his heart. And he goes and stays with, I think it was Annas, if I'm not mistaken. Some of you who are watching this might know off the top of your head. I think it was Annas. Anyway, he stays with this man. And Annas shows him what to do next. That's what the Spirit told Saul. So eventually, Saul was blinded, yet now he could see that Jesus was the Messiah. And he was persecuting Jesus by persecuting these Christians. And Saul did a complete 180 and then became Paul the Apostle. And eventually he became the apostle to the Gentile people. Very ironic, very poetic, very cool how Jesus chose Saul, a staunch Jew who was killing Christians, to spread the message of Jesus to the Gentile people who were as far from Jewish as you could possibly be. And Paul wrote much of the New Testament and the letters to the Gentile churches. And so I find it very humbling and exciting that God used the Jewish race and the people to spread the message to the entire world about Christ, the Messiah. There's lots of scriptures, lots of passages in the Bible about this history. The Bible, again, so sorry about this, you guys, my camera movements here. So much amazing history. The Bible is not, it's not a fantasy book. I mean, it's got some pretty incredible stories in it, that's for sure. Noah's Ark and, all the things that people tend to read to their children. But the book itself, man, it is absolutely amazing. Full of history through the eyes of the Jews, and then eventually going out to the Gentiles, the rest of us. So anyway, hopefully, I know I left some things out from my first video, but hopefully this video is a little more coherent than my other one. But anyway, just a recap and maybe some additions, and some subtractions probably. But I hope this made sense. Again, the Bible, there's so much depth, so much incredible history and stories and symbolism and the message of salvation for humanity. So I highly recommend it, whether you are a Christian or not a Christian. Maybe you're the farthest thing from a Christian that you could be. But man, I highly recommend that you read it. And dare I say, maybe even ask, if there is a God, to ask him to show you, as you read the Bible, what he wants to show you. So anyway, sorry for all the movement again. God bless. Look forward to hearing from you guys. Love you.